Can I have the police to 63B Tannacoy Road for possible murder, please?
What do you mean a possible murder?
Brian Whitelock, who I've just reported missing, has come out to the girl's house and he said he's killed her.
This wasn't the first time Brian Whitelock had taken a life, and it wouldn't be the first time he'd claimed he had no idea why he did it. Today, we uncover the horrifying case of Brian Whitelock, a man who, after serving time for a brutal murder, was given a second chance at life, only to kill again. Early life and first murder. Brian Lyndon Whitelock was born on the 28th of February 1967 in Swansea, Wales. He grew up in a working-class family, alongside his younger brother Glenn. By the time he reached adulthood, Whitelock had developed a reputation for drinking heavily, taking drugs, and struggling to keep his temper in check. By the year 2000, at 33 years old, Whitelock was already known for his violent outbursts, but no one could have predicted what he would do next. It was the night of Friday, the 13th of October 2000. Brian was drinking with his 27-year-old brother Glenn and 29-year-old friend Nicholas Morgan at Glenn's house in Portmead, Swansea. What started as a casual night of drinking soon turned into something far more sinister. At some point, an argument broke out. Witnesses would later say that all three were known for their heavy drinking, and with alcohol in their systems, tempers flared. Then, in an act of pure, uncontrolled rage, Brian grabbed a hammer and struck Nicholas Morgan with it, over and over. The blows were brutal, and Nicholas succumbed to his injuries almost immediately. But Whitelock wasn't finished. Now faced with the reality of what he had done, he made a desperate attempt to cover up his crime. He left the house, went to a nearby petrol station, and bought fuel. When he returned, his brother Glenn, either too drunk to know what had happened, or possibly in shock, had fallen asleep. And that's when Brian did the unthinkable. He doused the house in petrol and set it on fire. Did Glenn know what his brother had done? We may never know. But Brian left him there to die in the flames. Before escaping, he stole £1,000 from Glenn's wallet and fled. Instead of running away or hiding, he went to a pub in Swansea city centre. And while he sat drinking, he began telling people that travellers had set his brother's house on fire. It didn't take long for police to catch up with him. He was arrested that same day. An autopsy later confirmed that Nicholas Morgan had died from head injuries sustained in the attack, while Glenn Whitelock had perished in the fire, suffocating from smoke inhalation. During questioning, Brian denied everything. He claimed he hadn't even been there when the argument started. He said he left to go to the post office, and that by the time he returned, everything had already happened. But there was one major flaw in his story. While in the pub, he had told people that Glenn had died in the fire. At that time, the bodies hadn't even been identified yet. The only way Brian could have known that Glenn was dead was if he had been the one responsible. When forensic teams searched his clothes, they found traces of Nicholas Morgan's blood on them. The case against him was undeniable. At his trial, Brian Whitelock was found guilty of murder for Nicholas Morgan and guilty of manslaughter for Glenn Whitelock. For Nicholas's murder, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 18 years. For Glenn's manslaughter, he received a 10-year sentence. But both sentences were to run concurrently, meaning the 10-year sentence didn't add any additional time to his overall prison term. The judge described his actions as wicked and told him that he had caused unimaginable pain to both families. But what should have been the end of Brian Whitelock's story was only the beginning. Release and second chance. Fast forward 18 years to 2018. Whitelock had served his minimum sentence, and the parole board deemed him safe for release. This decision was met with fierce resistance. Nicholas Morgan's sister launched an online petition pleading with the authorities not to let Brian return to Swansea. Over 1,400 people signed it, but their voices were ignored. On the 2nd of January 2019, Brian Whitelock was officially released on licence. Despite having taken 2 lives, the system had deemed him fit to rejoin society. But within just 2 years, Whitelock assaulted a shop worker at a co-op and was arrested for criminal damage. Under his life licence, this should have sent him straight back to prison. But once again, the parole board ruled that he should be given another chance. He was released in October 2021. That decision would cost another innocent person their life. The murder of Wendy Buckney. By 2022, Brian Whitelock had moved into a flat on Tanny Coed Road, Swansea. His new neighbour was 71-year-old Wendy Buckney, a retired horse riding instructor known for her kindness, generosity, and community spirit. Despite knowing about Brian's criminal history, Wendy welcomed him. She believed in second chances and even hired him to do odd jobs around her home. To Whitelock, Wendy was like a second mother, but by August 2022, things were starting to unravel. Brian had developed a heavy addiction to Valium, the same drug he had been high on when he murdered Nicholas Morgan. Neighbours reported seeing him acting erratically, talking to CCTV cameras, and screaming about up police brutality. Then, on the 22nd of August 2022, Wendy was seen arriving home at 6:50 p.m. Just half an hour later, Brian was captured on CCTV walking towards her home, making aggressive gestures. Sometime between 10 p.m. and the early hours of the morning, Brian Whitelock unleashed hell upon Wendy Buckney. He stabbed, beat, and brutalized her. By the time he was done, Wendy's body was barely recognizable. He stripped her naked and left her lying on the living room floor, surrounded by blood-stained furniture, shattered glass, and broken wood. The next morning, he stumbled out of Wendy's home, covered in blood. And when his neighbor asked what had happened, Brian simply said, "I think I've killed her. I have killed her." Arrest and confession. As Brian Whitelock staggered out of Wendy's home, his neighbor stood frozen in shock. Whitelock, half naked and covered in blood, dropped to his knees on the front lawn and began rubbing dirt and grass into his skin, mumbling the same chilling words over and over. "I killed her. I don't know why. She was begging me to stop." His neighbor immediately called 999. "Brian's covered in blood. He just told me he's killed her." The emergency operator, struggling to process what they were hearing, asked, "Where is she now?" Brian turned his bloodshot eyes toward them and muttered, "She's inside. She's stone cold." Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Wendy lying face down in her living room, completely naked and unresponsive. The room was a scene of utter devastation. Furniture smashed, objects strewn across the floor, and blood splattered on the walls, ceiling, and even the windows. A forensic team later discovered that Brian had attempted to wipe down surfaces, but the sheer brutality of the crime made any attempt to cover his tracks futile. Whitelock was arrested on the spot. As officers placed him in the back of the police van, he continued his rambling confession, saying, "Chunks of her were falling off. It looks like I tortured her. I deserve to be locked up." But despite his confessions, what followed was a drawn-out legal battle, one that saw Whitelock attempting every possible excuse to avoid taking responsibility. Trial and defense. Brian Whitelock initially admitted to killing Wendy. He told police, "I don't even know why I did it. She was the nicest person in the world." But once inside a courtroom, his story changed completely. At first, he claimed that two shadowy figures had broken into Wendy's flat, attacked her, and left before he arrived. When that story fell apart, he changed it again. This time, he blamed Wendy. He claimed that Wendy had been making sexual advances toward him and that he had snapped. But the evidence told a very different story. The prosecution presented forensic reports detailing Wendy's injuries, over 70 wounds in total. She had been stabbed, beaten, and brutalized with multiple weapons, including a knife, a broken table leg, and wooden shelving. Her arms showed defensive wounds, meaning she fought for her life. The injuries were so extreme that the forensic pathologist refused to count them all. The court also heard how Whitelock had been abusing Valium and alcohol, despite knowing it made him violent and unpredictable. The judge described his actions as sadistic, cruel, and completely unprovoked. As the trial progressed, Whitelock became increasingly erratic. At one point, he fired his entire defense team. At another, he shouted at the jury, screaming, "I hope you all suffer a brain injury like I did." But when the guilty verdict was read, he refused to return to the courtroom, instead choosing to watch the sentencing via video link, and the judge did not hold back. Sentencing. On the 11th of November 2024, Brian Whitelock was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning he will never be released from prison. The judge ruled that his crimes were among the worst imaginable, stating, "You inflicted sustained and exceptionally cruel violence upon a defenseless woman who showed you nothing but kindness. Your complete lack of control, combined with your history of murder, makes you a permanent danger to society." This was the first time in over 20 years that a man had been sentenced to a whole life term in Wales, and this time there would be no second chances. The aftermath. Wendy's family released a heartbreaking statement after the trial saying, "Wendy was the kindest, most generous soul. She believed in helping people, even those who didn't deserve it. She trusted Whitelock. She gave him work, gave him friendship, and he repaid her with unimaginable cruelty." Her sister added, "No sentence will ever bring Wendy back, but at least we know he will never walk free again." The case also raised serious questions about the parole system. How had a man who already killed two people, one of whom was his own brother, been deemed safe for release? How had he been allowed to return to Swansea, where his previous victim's family still lived? And why had no one stepped in when neighbors repeatedly reported his erratic behavior in the months leading up to Wendy's murder? A formal investigation was launched into how Whitelock was ever freed from prison in the first place, but for Wendy's loved ones, no report or apology will ever undo what happened. Conclusion. Brian Whitelock was a man who had already been given a second chance. The justice system released him, believing he was rehabilitated. Wendy Buckney believed in second chances too. She trusted him, and for that, she paid with her life. This case serves as a chilling reminder that some people should never be given the opportunity to reoffend, and that in some cases, a life sentence should mean exactly that. If you found this case as shocking as we did, please consider subscribing for more true crime cases from Dark Britain Files. What do you think? Should Whitelock ever have been released? Let us know in the comments, and until next time, stay safe.